We've been talking about security as we got started, and this is where I'm going to be focusing is the security world. And there's a panel that's after me that's also going to talk about security. Security is my world. This is kind of how I grew up. I spent a lot of time in the Army, did a full career, worked at the White House for a while, National Security Council, was over at SRI right down the road. Verizon hired me to do policy work, and my mind is in national security and how do we think big? How do we think about the threats against our nation, as well as the role of industry, and how do we make America work? How do we keep our country safe? And it turns out what we do in our country is very similar to what other countries do. It is all about keeping our lifestyle, our way of life, our thinking, everything protected so we can do the same. In fact, my peers over in China, which we might see as a direct enemy, they do the same thing I do. It's just through their lens, and we find a lot of commonality. So that's where I'm coming from. But I also work for Verizon. We're a big networking company, so a lot of what I'm going to talk about in the next 30 minutes is very network-centric. So I'm not going to really go up into devices and apps and clouds and things, but I want to talk about the network. We're all very familiar with the good old ARPANET and whatnot, so that's where I'm going to kind of get the little story started. Our communications system here in the United States is completely private, and in fact, we're probably the only country that all the way back to the era of Morse code, the 1830s and moving forward, that all the comms, everything we've got, has been privately owned. There was 1 year in World War II when President Wilson nationalized everything, so I'll take that off the table. Compare that to other countries, though, where you have a post telephone and telegraph or a Ministry of Telecommunications or something, or a semi-public private operation. We don't do that in the United States. And so there's a high dependency for national security, for emergency preparedness, for continuity of operations, for the day-to-day, what we all do depends on the private sector. And so we in communications companies take that absolutely serious. And we always think about what could disrupt this, what makes it go away, what would cause some outage to happen. And in our older world, this was always a physical conversation. Now we worry about lightning strikes, we worry about backhoe, fiber-seeking backhoe operators, things like that. And yeah, that's still there. Yeah, my buddies at Verizon know where I'm coming from. But now we have this virtual world. We have humans that are trying to attack our networks, not just Mother Earth. We have new applications, new science, new things that are riding on top of these old networks that really were designed to counter threats that nature threw at us versus threats that people are going to throw at us. And that's an interesting insight, because security isn't just about the bad guy, the bad actor, but it's also about the bad planet. And it's about natural systems and other things that are out there. So I'm going to show you how all this kind of works together. Over at Homeland Security, I spend a lot of time with them. And in fact, earlier this afternoon, I had to go over to Stanford and meet with NIST and DHS and White House on some stuff that's happening. And most everybody's aware the president's coming in tonight. We're going to totally screw up the traffic around here. That's just the way it goes. That's our life in Washington. Things are always stopping when the president moves. He lands at SFO in another hour or two, and then they'll have the motorcade. And so just don't try and drive anywhere tonight or tomorrow. Things will be fine. He'll leave on Saturday, and he's out of here. But he'll be at Stanford tomorrow, so there will be a big mess, and I'm going to be over there messing around and all that. But we've developed these plans, like the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, that takes a big holistic look at everything from railroads to comms to airplanes and chemical things and whatnot. And we try and wrap it all together and try and understand where the threats come from. And we now understand it is physical, it is cyber, and it is human. And I'm going to talk about all these and why this is something we need to understand from a technical perspective, how all these things come together so we can build better, more secure systems going forward. Well, the good old internet, and I'll use the internet, cyberspace, things like that sort of interchangeably, but I think we all understand what we're talking about. The internet in the context of ICANN, domain names, BGP routing, that kind of internet, there is no authority. There is no king of the internet, there's no president of the internet, there's no company that runs the internet, there's nobody in charge. In fact, it's the biggest get-along we've ever had in the history of humankind here on this planet, where we all just agree to get along. We've got a basic set of RFCs, some basic connection principles that we work off of, but you can break and violate an RFC and things still work. Your friends may not like you a lot, but it still works. Tens of thousands of systems that operate autonomously. They're called autonomous systems. They have numbers, ASNs. They all interconnect with each other, and they get along. And things just magically work, and your little cell phone does what it's supposed to do. And I think it's fascinating what we've built over the last several decades. A lot of it, as you know, is based on military research. The 1960s and 70s, thinking about how do you build survivable networks? Could they survive a nuclear warfare? Could they survive other things? So that the DNA of our internet today at the network level is based on this thinking of building all these separate networks that share some commonality, and they can move information around regardless of operating system, regardless of manufacturer, doesn't matter whose mainframe it was or micro or whatever, it's all going to seamlessly work. Now, in terms of security, back in the 60s and 70s, the trust model, they had to anchor some trust someplace. And the only thing they could really trust in those days were the researchers, because this is what it was about. It was a DoD-funded project. National Science Foundation, after a while, gets into it. We've got hundreds or thousands of researchers building these networks, and they would not violate the trust. In other words, if I was adding a network component in 1978 or 79 to the ARPANET, I'm not going to maliciously go in there and do damage, because why? This is an experiment. Why would I want to mess with it? And so as time evolves, the networks begin to think in terms of humans as being trustworthy. What you couldn't trust was the physical world. You couldn't trust the phone company that glues it all together. And in fact, the protocols that emerged from the 70s, particularly the TCP/IP suite, trusts the users to not abuse it. It's designed to route around physical problems and natural problems, not human problems. But what is our, back then we had maybe in 1980, we had a few tens of thousands of researchers connected. Today we have a third of humanity connected. But yet the soul of the internet still assumes that the human is trustworthy. Is that a valid assumption? And you can see this is built in today. In 2015, that assumption is still there. So when it all started, the early players, yeah, they were commercial somewhere, a few, nothing like today, but mostly military, mostly academic, mostly researchers. If you were a home user, all of you saw the movie War Games, you had a little dial-up computer and you might dial into some service someplace, a Radio Shack thing or a Prodigy, or you remember all that stuff that we used to dial into, but they weren't part of the bigger internet. That all started to happen in the 1990s. Well, when the ARPANET got going, fall of '69, the big, amazing event that happens when we have a connection between two mainframe computers. This is where it was logged and, preserved for history to see. The thinking there in terms of rules of the road was very, very academic. But there had to be some rules. There had to be some basic understandings that if I'm going to take this mainframe and talk it to this mainframe, that somehow some magic was going to glue it together. BBN was kind of arbitrating that and coming up with interfaces where it didn't matter if it was a Honeywell or an IBM or whatever talking, but they would speak the same rule set so they could communicate. Those rules are also very baked in to today's internet, even though those rules were written to favor the research community, because back then it was all a big research project. And if you ask any of the men and women involved in it, they would have told you back then they were not thinking in terms of this ever becoming what it is today, in terms of this large commercial thing. It was going to be research, I write my papers, I shut down what I'm working on, go get some more funding from the government, start another research project, rinse and repeat. And that was where they were going to go. Well, one of the fundamental rules that was put forth was this thing called the ARPANET reference model, the ARM. And it's fairly easy to understand. It's just a very fundamental thing that says we're going to create these intercomputer networking protocols. And what we're talking about is how two computers talk to each other, not the protocols of a network. In other words, we're not interested in whether I'm doing time division, multiplexing, or blah, 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 blah. I'm really interested in how do these two computers communicate. So I'm developing computer protocols that are different from communications protocols. And these computer protocols, we're going to assume that I'm going to have thousands, if not millions, of different computers speaking all different languages, different types of hardware, very, very heterogeneous type of environment. Not a monoculture, not a standard way of doing it, but lots of different things. Almost like in human world, where we have 7 billion humans, but each one of us is different. And we've developed our own protocols for how to get along with each other, even though we are not exactly DNA copies of one another. But yet what's happened over time, though, is that even though we were trying to build these heterogeneous networks where hosts of all different things could talk to each other, we didn't want to have a monoculture. But yet we began to, in the early days, we began seeing as they do resource sharing, some things begin to emerge, like Telnet and FTP and other protocols that everybody starts to center in on. So rather than only having lots of different ways that I could do a keyboard type exchange, Telnet becomes like the dominant way of doing it. File transfer becomes the dominant way of moving things. And even later, as HTTP comes along for web-enabled, there's really no other protocol out there that competes with HTTP. We've kind of settled on that.